Danny Cook was not the kind of man who showed up in history books. He was 34 years old, 5'8", built like a barrel, and had hands that were permanently scarred from years of grease burns and hot pans. He had grown up in Memphis, Tennessee, in a house where the kitchen was the center of everything. His grandmother had taught him how to make cornbread before he could tie his shoes. His father had shown him how to build a smoker out of an old oil drum when he was 12. By the time he was 16, he could cook a rack of ribs that would make a grown man weep, and by 20, he was running the grill at a barbecue joint on Beale Street that had a line around the block every Saturday. He had joined the Terran fleet not because he wanted to fight, but because the recruiter had told him the pay was good and the ships went places no one had ever been. Danny had always wanted to see the stars. He figured he could see them and still make a decent pot of gumbo along the way. He was assigned to the carrier Starfall as a civilian food services contractor, which was a fancy way of saying he ran the mess hall. When he arrived, the kitchen was a disaster. The previous cook had been serving vacuum-sealed protein paste and rehydrated vegetable mush to a crew of 400. Morale in the mess was so low that most of the crew had started skipping meals entirely and living off ration bars they kept in their bunks. Danny changed that in his first week. He scrubbed the kitchen from floor to ceiling. He recalibrated the ovens. He filed a requisition order for actual spices that was so long his supervisor thought it was a joke. When the requisition was denied, he started smuggling supplies aboard in his personal luggage. He traded favors with cargo handlers on supply runs to get real garlic, real onions, real butter. He found an unused hydroponics bay on Deck 9 and began growing cilantro, green onions, and basil without telling anyone. When the chief engineer discovered the unauthorized garden 3 months later, she tasted the fresh pesto Danny had made with the basil and decided she had never seen any garden on Deck 9 and never would. Within 6 months, the mess hall on the Starfall was the most popular room on the ship. Crew members from other shifts would show up early just to get a seat. Danny made fried catfish on Fridays. He made red beans and rice on Mondays. He made biscuits every morning from scratch, real biscuits, the kind that were fluffy on the inside and golden on the outside, and tasted like someone cared about you. The crew loved him. The officers loved him. The captain of the Starfall once admitted privately that Danny Cook was the single greatest asset on his ship, and he meant it. Danny had once made jambalaya during a hull breach. Emergency bulkheads were slamming shut. The damage control team was running past the galley in full gear. Danny stood at his stove with a wooden spoon in his hand and refused to leave until the rice was done. When asked later why he hadn't evacuated, he said the jambalaya was at a critical stage, and you don't abandon rice at a critical stage, not for anything. He was, in short, exactly the kind of person Peggy Dunn needed. When the shuttle carrying Danny docked at Relay 11, Nate Grady was waiting at the airlock. He watched a stocky man in a stained apron step through the door, carrying 2 heavy crates, a battered cast-iron skillet balanced on top, like a crown. Danny looked around the station with the expression of someone sizing up a new kitchen, which was exactly what he was doing. "Commander," Danny said, setting down the crates and shaking Nate's hand, "Peggy tells me you've got guests who've never had a real meal." "Something like that. The Valoran delegation. Their leader is a warblade named Keth Voron. 7 feet tall, 4 arms. Not exactly friendly." Danny nodded slowly, as if Nate had just told him the oven ran a little hot. "What's he been eating?" "Nutrient blocks, compressed protein and mineral supplements. No flavor, no texture, just fuel." Danny stared at Nate for a long, quiet moment. There was something in his eyes that looked almost like pity, not for a dangerous alien warlord, but for any living creature that had gone its entire life without knowing what good food tasted like. "That's a crime," Danny said softly. "That is a crime against the soul." He picked up his crates and asked where the kitchen was. There wasn't one. Danny looked at the empty storage room Peggy had designated for him. rolled up his sleeves, and got to work. Within an hour, he had built a functional cooking station out of station components, portable heating elements from the shuttle, and sheer willpower. He laid out his ingredients on a metal table like a surgeon preparing for an operation. Garlic, butter, onions, smoked paprika, dried chili flakes, brown sugar, salt, black pepper, apple cider vinegar, a vacuum-sealed rack of pork ribs that he had been saving in the Starfall's cold storage for what he called a special occasion. This, Danny decided, qualified. The Valeran delegation was in the main chamber, seated across from the human diplomats for another round of talks that were going nowhere. Kef Voron sat like a statue, his forearms folded across his massive chest, his amber eyes fixed on Nate with the patience of a predator who was not impressed. Drayan Solth stood behind him, her hand resting near her sidearm, her gaze sweeping the room in slow, constant arcs. Nobody was making progress. The translators hummed. Voices rose and fell. Terms were proposed and rejected. The room felt like a box that was slowly getting smaller. Then the smell arrived. It came softly at first, creeping through the ventilation system like a whisper. Warm, rich, complex. It was butter melting in a hot pan, garlic hitting oil, onions turning golden at the edges. It was smoke and sweetness winding together into something that had no name in any Valoran language, because nothing like it had ever existed in their world. Nate noticed it and glanced at Peggy. She gave him a small nod. The Valoran noticed it too. Their olfactory slits, long vertical openings along the sides of their jaws, were far more sensitive than any human nose. They could detect chemical compounds at concentrations so low that human instruments would miss them entirely. And right now, every Valoran in that room was being hit by a wave of sensory information that their brains had absolutely no framework for processing. Keth's crest plates twitched. It was a tiny movement, barely visible, but Peggy saw it. She had studied Valoran body language long enough to know what it meant. Involuntary interest. The kind of reaction that happened before the conscious mind could shut it down. Drayan Solth's nostrils flared. She blinked twice, rapidly, and then forced her expression back to neutral. One of the Valoran guards near the door shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes moved toward the corridor where the smell was coming from, then snapped back to his post. Nobody said a word about it. The negotiations continued. But something had changed in the room. Something small and warm and persistent had slipped through a crack in the wall that 11 years of war had built. And it smelled like slow-cooked pork ribs basted in Memphis-style barbecue sauce. In the storage room down the hall, Danny Cook stood over his makeshift smoker, wooden spoon in hand, humming a song his grandmother used to sing. He turned the ribs, he checked the sauce, he tasted it, added a pinch more brown sugar, and smiled. He didn't know anything about galactic politics or alien psychology or the delicate art of interstellar diplomacy, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty, a truth so old and so simple that it predated starships and wars and borders and everything else that people used to keep each other apart. Good food fixes things. It took Danny 3 hours to finish the ribs. He could have rushed them, but rushing ribs was something Danny Cook would never do. Not if the building was on fire, not if the station was under attack, not if every admiral in the fleet was standing behind him tapping their foot. Good barbecue takes time. That was not a suggestion. That was a law of the universe, as far as Danny was concerned, and he followed it the way other men followed gravity. He had built a smoker out of ventilation ductwork and a heating coil he had pulled from a broken wall panel. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. The ribs sat inside on a rack, low and slow, the heat barely above a whisper, the smoke curling around the meat like it was telling it a secret. Every 30 minutes, Danny opened the smoker and basted the ribs with his sauce, a thick, dark mixture of apple cider vinegar, brown sugar, smoked paprika, black pepper, a touch of chili, and a few other things he kept in his head, and nowhere else. The sauce was his grandmother's recipe, or at least it had started that way. Over the years, Danny had added to it, adjusted it, made it his own, the way a river carves its own path, while still following the shape of the land. Peggy checked in on him twice during the cook. The first time, she asked how it was going. Danny told her it was going the way it was supposed to go, which meant slowly. The second time, she didn't ask anything. She just stood in the doorway and breathed in, and a look crossed her face that Danny recognized, the look of someone remembering something good from a long time ago. "Smells like my dad's backyard," she said quietly. Danny nodded. That's the whole point. When the ribs were done, Danny lifted them out of the smoker and set them on a cutting board. The meat had pulled back from the bone, just enough to show a perfect smoke ring, a thin pink line beneath the bark that told you the smoke had done its work. The outside was dark and caramelized, almost black in places, lacquered with sauce that had reduced into something thick and glossy and deeply, impossibly fragrant. Danny cut the rack into individual ribs with a long knife, arranged them on a metal plate he had scrubbed clean 3 times, and carried them down the corridor toward the main chamber. The negotiations had stalled again. Keth Voron was speaking in low, clipped tones about territorial boundaries. Nate was responding with the careful patience of a man defusing a bomb. Drayan Salth stood behind Keth like a shadow with teeth. The room was tense and tired and going nowhere. Then Danny walked in. Every head turned. The smell entered the room before he did, rolling through the air like a warm tide. Danny crossed to the table, set the plate down in front of Keth Voron, and stepped back. He wiped his hands on his apron and stood there with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he had made and what it was going to do. Keth looked down at the plate. For a long moment, he simply stared. The ribs sat in a pool of their own juices, the sauce catching the overhead lights and gleaming like something precious. Steam rose from the meat in slow, lazy curls. The smell was overwhelming, even by human standards. For a Valoran, with olfactory receptors nearly 6 times more sensitive, it must have been like standing in the middle of a symphony played at full volume. Keth looked at Danny. His amber eyes were narrow, suspicious. "What is this?" he asked through the translator. His voice was flat and hard. "Memphis-style barbecue ribs," Danny said. "Slow smoked for 3 hours, basted in a sauce made from scratch. Best thing you'll ever put in your mouth, and I mean that with all due respect. Is this part of your negotiation strategy, Commander? Offering me animal flesh prepared in primitive conditions?" Nate opened his mouth, but Peggy spoke first. She leaned forward with her elbows on the table and looked Keth directly in the eyes, which was either very brave or very foolish, depending on who you asked. "Warblade Voron," she said calmly. "On Earth, sharing a meal with someone is one of the oldest signs of trust. We are not trying to trick you. We are trying to show you something about who we are. If you don't want to eat, that's your right. But if you're willing to try, I think you might understand us a little better than you do right now." Keth held her gaze for a long time. Then he looked back at the plate. His crest plates shifted slightly, a movement so subtle that only Peggy noticed. He reached out with his lower left hand and picked up a single rib. He held it close to his face and examined it, turning it slowly, studying the texture of the bark, the way the sauce clung to the meat, the thin wisps of steam still rising from the bone. He brought it to his olfactory slits and inhaled. Something flickered behind his eyes, something he didn't have a word for. He bit into the rib. The room went completely silent. For 1 second, nothing happened. Keth chewed slowly, his jaw working through the tender meat, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes went wide, not a little wide, fully wide. All four of his pupils expanded at once, until the amber was nearly gone, swallowed by black. His crest shot upright so fast it made an audible click. His two free hands, the upper pair, slammed down on the table and gripped the edge with a force that bent the metal inward. A sound came out of his throat, low and deep and entirely involuntary, something the translator tried and failed to process, something that was not language, but something older and more honest than language. Drayan Salt's hand went to her weapon. Two Valeran guards stepped forward with their rifles raised. One of the human security officers reached for his sidearm. "Stand down," Keth said. His voice was thick, strained, as if he were speaking through something heavy sitting on his chest. "All of you, stand down. That is an order." The guards hesitated. Drayan looked at Keth with open alarm. His biomonitor, a small device embedded in the scales at his wrist, was beeping rapidly. His heart rate had doubled. His neural activity had spiked into ranges that the Valeran medical manuals associated with combat stimulant overdose. Aboard the Valeran medical ship, orbiting the station, a physician named Tarek Voss was staring at his readout screen in open horror, his finger hovering over the emergency extraction command, convinced that the warblade had been poisoned. Keth took another bite. His entire body shuddered. A thin membrane, a second eyelid that most Valeran didn't even know they still had, flickered across his eyes for the first time in his life. The pleasure signals flooding his nervous system were so intense that his brain was struggling to categorize them. His species had evolved on a world of gray rock and tasteless food. Their bodies had developed sensory receptors of extraordinary sensitivity to detect even the faintest trace of nutrition in the barren soil of their homeworld. But those receptors had never been given anything worth detecting. They had been built to find a whisper, and Danny Cook had just given them a thunderstorm. He did not speak. He did not look up. He ate with the slow, focused intensity of someone experiencing something that was rearranging the inside of their head. Sauce dripped from his claws. He did not wipe them. When the last bone was bare, Keth sat perfectly still. His crest was still raised. His breathing was heavy and slow. His eyes were half closed. The room was so quiet that Nate could hear the hum of the station's air recyclers 3 decks away. Drayan Salt looked like she wanted to either call a medic or start shooting something. The Valeran guards had lowered their rifles, but hadn't reholstered them. The human delegation sat frozen, unsure if they had just witnessed a diplomatic breakthrough or a medical emergency. Keth Varan opened his eyes. He looked at Danny Cook, the small, stocky human in the stained apron, who was standing 3 feet away, with his hands clasped behind his back, and a look on his face that was calm and knowing, and just a little bit proud. Keth spoke 5 words. The translator rendered them with perfect clarity, and they landed in the silence of that room like stones dropped into still water. "What else can you make?" Danny Cook smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting his whole life for someone to ask him that question, and mean it the way Keth Varan meant it right now. "Brother," Danny said, "you have no idea." Over the next 3 days, Danny Cook turned the storage room on Relay 11 into the most important place in the galaxy, and he did it with butter, fire, and an old cast-iron skillet that had never let him down. He started the second morning with fried chicken. He had brought the flour and the spices from the Starfall, along with a small container of buttermilk he had been saving. He brined the chicken overnight, dredged it in seasoned flour, and fried it in a deep pan until the coating was golden and shattering, and the meat inside was so juicy it made a sound when you bit into it. He served it on a plain metal tray with nothing else, because fried chicken doesn't need anything else. It is complete. Keth Varan ate 4 pieces without saying a word, On the third piece, his crest began vibrating at a frequency that none of the humans could hear, but that made the Valoran guards exchange nervous glances. On the fourth piece, he closed his eyes and didn't open them for nearly a minute. When he finally did, he looked at Drayan Solf and said something in Valoran that the translator couldn't fully process. But Peggy, who had spent years studying the language, caught the meaning. It was roughly equivalent to, "I have been a fool my entire life." Drayan Solf, who had refused to eat on the first day out of professional discipline, lasted until noon on the second day. Danny made macaroni and cheese with a 4-cheese blend, baked until the top was bubbling and crusty, and the smell broke her resolve like a wave breaks a sandcastle. She sat down at the table stiffly, as if she were performing an unpleasant duty, and took a single bite with the rigid posture of a woman who was not going to enjoy this. She chewed, she swallowed, she sat very still. Then she took another bite, and another, and she did not stop until the bowl was empty. She set the spoon down gently, straightened her back, and returned to her post behind Keth. She said nothing about it to anyone, but Peggy noticed that from that point on, Drayan's hand no longer rested near her sidearm. By the middle of the second day, the formal structure of the ceasefire talks had quietly dissolved into something no one had planned. The negotiating sessions still happened, but they were shorter now, and the tone was different. Kath asked fewer hostile questions. Nate spoke more freely. There were pauses in the discussion that weren't tense, but were simply people thinking, which is a very different kind of silence. And between the sessions, everyone drifted toward the kitchen. Danny made collard greens braised low and slow with smoked turkey necks, until the greens were soft and silky, and the pot liquor at the bottom was rich enough to drink on its own. He made cornbread with honey butter that crumbled the way cornbread is supposed to crumble, soft at the center and crisp at the edges. He made shrimp and grits with a sauce that had garlic and white wine, and just enough heat to make the back of your tongue tingle. He made peach cobbler with a brown sugar crumble that came out of the oven bubbling and golden, and smelling like a summer evening in a place where the air was warm and the light was long. Each dish hit the Valoran differently, but they all hit hard. The science of it, which Peggy later documented in a report that would become one of the most cited papers in xenobiological history, was remarkable. The Valoran had evolved on Valor Prime, a barren, rocky world with minimal biodiversity. Their food sources were sparse and nearly flavorless, soft-bodied organisms that grew in mineral deposits and provided nutrition without any of the complex chemical compounds that give food its taste. In response, Valoran biology had developed sensory receptors of astonishing sensitivity. Their taste buds were not just more numerous than human ones, they were structurally different, capable of detecting flavor compounds at concentrations 100 times below the human threshold. Their neural pathways connected taste directly to their deepest reward centers, the same systems that govern satisfaction in combat, the sense of tribal belonging, and the rare, sacred feeling they called Valith, a word that roughly translated to rightness with the world. These systems had never been properly activated. For the entire history of their species, the Valoran had eaten to survive. The idea that eating could be a source of joy was not just unfamiliar to them, it was inconceivable. They had no word for delicious. They had no word for flavor. They had a word for adequate nutrition, and that was as far as their culinary vocabulary extended. Human food changed all of that in the space of a single bite. The sugars in Danny's peach cobbler activated pleasure pathways that the Valoran used for celebrating victory. The capsaicin in his chili triggered a euphoric pain response loop that left Keth gripping the table and breathing through his teeth with an expression that looked like agony, but was in fact the most intense joy he had ever experienced. The umami in the slow-braised meats created a deep, resonant sense of satisfaction that Keth later struggled to describe through the translator. The closest he came was saying it felt like the universe telling you that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. On the third morning, the situation escalated. A young Valoran scout named Fen Tural, barely old enough to be called a soldier, had been standing guard near the kitchen corridor since the first day. He was thin by Valoran standards, with pale gray scales and a crest that hadn't fully hardened yet. He had been doing his best to remain professional, but the smells coming from Danny's kitchen had been torturing him for 2 days, and his discipline finally cracked. Danny found him standing in the doorway, looking at a bowl of banana pudding with an expression that was equal parts longing and terror. Danny didn't say a word. He just picked up the bowl, held it out, and nodded. Fen took the bowl. He tasted the pudding. He stood there for a long time without moving, the spoon halfway to his mouth, his eyes fixed on something far away that nobody else could see. Then liquid began leaking from his ocular ducts, thin, clear streams running down his scaled face and dripping off his jaw. He didn't know what was happening. He looked at Danny with open alarm. "Something is wrong with my eyes," he said through the translator. "Am I damaged?" A human medic who had been nearby stepped forward and gently explained that he was crying. It was an emotional response. It meant the experience had moved him in a way that his body didn't have any other way to express. Fen considered this. "Is it a disease?" he asked. "No," the medic said. "It's just feelings." Fen looked down at the pudding. Then he looked back at the medic. "May I have more?" He could. By the end of the third day, every Valoran on the station had eaten something from Danny's kitchen. The formal pretense that this was a ceasefire negotiation with an unusual catering arrangement had collapsed entirely. Guards were sitting at tables with their helmets off. One of the Valoran engineers had offered to fix Danny's makeshift smoker in exchange for a second helping of ribs. Dre and Salth had been seen smiling, an event so unprecedented that 2 of her subordinates later filed incident reports about it. Then, the Valoran High Command found out. The medical ship orbiting the station had been monitoring the delegation's biometrics the entire time, and the readings were alarming. Heart rates elevated, neural activity spiking into unprecedented ranges, adrenal analogs flooding the bloodstream, pleasure responses at levels that the medical database classified as consistent with exposure to weaponized neurochemical agents. The attending physician, who had been sending increasingly panicked reports up the chain of command for 2 days, finally triggered a full alert. Within hours, a Valoran battle fleet jumped to the edge of the system. 12 warships, weapons charged, shields raised. The fleet commander, Admiral Soren Kahl, sent a single transmission to Relay 11, demanding to know what the humans had done to his soldiers. Nate Grady read the transmission, took a long breath, and looked at Peggy. "They think we poisoned them," Peggy said. "Of course they do," Nate said. He was remarkably calm for a man who had a battle fleet pointing guns at him. He thought for a moment, then turned to Danny. "Can you make enough food for 50 people?" Danny didn't even blink. "Give me 6 hours." Danny worked through the night. He cooked ribs and fried chicken and cornbread and cobbler in quantities that would have exhausted a normal man. Peggy helped him pack it all into sealed containers. Nate arranged for a shuttle to carry the shipment to the Valoran flagship, along with a handwritten note from Peggy that read, "It is called cooking. It is not a weapon. It is a gift. Please try the cobbler first." 12 hours later, the Valoran flagship sent a message back through official diplomatic channels. Admiral Soren Kahl, a decorated military commander who had led fleets through some of the bloodiest engagements of the war, sent a single line of text that was forwarded, within days, to every intelligence agency and diplomatic office in the known galaxy. It read, "We require the recipe." Nate read the message and started laughing. He laughed until his eyes watered, until his ribs hurt, until he had to sit down because his legs wouldn't hold him. Even the security team was grinning. In the kitchen, Danny Cook scraped the last of the sauce from his pan, tasted it off the spoon, and nodded to himself. Then he started cleaning up, because a good cook always leaves a clean kitchen, even when he has just accidentally prevented an interstellar war. The ceasefire was signed 6 days after Danny Cook had first set foot on Relay 11. 6 days, 11 years of bloodshed, millions of dead on both sides, entire worlds scarred beyond recognition, and it took 6 days and a man with a cast-iron skillet to bring it to an end. The signing took place in the same circular chamber where the negotiations had begun. The room looked different now. The armed guards were still there, but they stood easier, their postures looser, their weapons held with less intent. The long table, where the two delegations sat across from each other, no longer felt like a barrier. It felt for the first time like what it actually was, a table where people sat down together. Nate Grady signed on behalf of the Terran Collective. His hand was steady. But Peggy, sitting beside him, could see the faintest tremor at the corner of his jaw. The kind of tension that comes not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of a moment you never dared to believe would arrive. Nate had lost his brother to this war. He had spent 8 years carrying that loss across the stars, and now he was writing his name at the bottom of the document that said it was over. Peggy put her hand on his arm, just briefly, just enough to let him know she saw him. He didn't look at her, but he nodded once, very slightly, and that was enough. Keth Voron signed on behalf of the Valoran Dominion. He used his lower left hand, the same hand that had picked up that first rib 3 days earlier. There was still a faint trace of barbecue sauce on his claw. He had not cleaned it. Whether this was an oversight or a deliberate choice, no one ever asked. But Peggy noticed, and she smiled to herself, because she understood that some things carry meaning precisely because they are left unspoken. The terms of the accord were extensive. Territorial lines were redrawn. Prisoners of war would be exchanged within 90 days. Reparations would be calculated by a joint commission. Demilitarized zones would be established along the former front lines. Military assets would be withdrawn according to a phase schedule. It was all very proper, very detailed, and very much what one would expect from the end of a major interstellar conflict. And then there was Article 14, Section 7. It was tucked near the end of the document, between a clause about scientific data sharing and another about communications relay maintenance. It was written in the dry, precise language of formal treaty law, but its contents were unlike anything that had ever appeared in a peace accord in the history of the known galaxy. Article 14, Section 7, formally titled the Cook Provision, established a permanent joint culinary exchange program between the Terran Collective and the Valoran Dominion. Under its terms, human chefs would be stationed aboard Valoran vessels and at Valoran installations, providing meals prepared with human ingredients and techniques. Valoran agricultural worlds would begin cultivating earth crops, starting with wheat, corn, garlic, and a variety of stone fruits suitable for cobbler. A formal culinary academy would be established on the neutral world of Tessera 3, funded equally by both governments, to train members of both species in the science and art of cooking. The provision also included a personal clause that Keth Voron had insisted on during the final hours of negotiation. It stated that Danny Cook would be granted unrestricted access to Valoran space, diplomatic immunity in all Dominion territories, and a permanent supply budget funded by the Valoran military. When Nate had asked Keth why the Valoran military should be paying for a human cook's grocery bill, Keth had looked at him with an expression that suggested the question was the most foolish thing he had ever heard. Because, Keth said through the translator, his voice low and final, He has done more damage to our willingness to fight than any weapon your species has ever built. That is worth funding." Danny Cook stood at the back of the room during the signing ceremony. He had not been invited to sit at the table. He was not a diplomat or an officer or anyone of official importance. He was a civilian cook in a stained apron who had been brought aboard a space station to make barbecue. And somehow, in ways that nobody had predicted and nobody could fully explain, he had become the hinge on which the entire piece turned. He was offered medals afterward. He turned them down. He was offered a formal rank in the Terran military. He said, "No, thank you." He was offered a title, Cultural Ambassador to the Valoran Dominion, that came with a salary, a staff, and a residence on Tessera 3. He thought about it for a long time, and then said he'd take the residence, but only if it came with a proper kitchen. Not a laboratory, not a facility, a kitchen, with good ventilation and enough counter space to roll out biscuit dough. He got what he asked for. In the months and years that followed, the cook provision became the most successful and most unusual element of the Helion Accords. Human chefs traveled to Valoran worlds and set up kitchens in military bases, diplomatic compounds, and eventually in civilian neighborhoods. They taught classes, they opened restaurants, they introduced an entire species to the concept that eating could be a source of happiness, and that the preparation of food could be an act of love. The Valoran, for their part, took to it with a fervor that startled everyone. They were a disciplined, methodical people, and they approached cooking the way they approached everything else, with intense focus and a desire to master it completely. Within a year, Valoran cooks were producing their own variations of human dishes, adapted for local ingredients, but faithful to the principles Danny had shown them. Within 3 years, the Culinary Academy on Tessera 3 had a waiting list that stretched for months. Within 5 years, human restaurants had opened on over 40 Valoran worlds, and the most popular dish, on every single one of them, was Memphis-style barbecue ribs. The second most popular was banana pudding. Fen Taral, the young scout who had cried in a doorway on Relay 11, resigned from the Valoran military 9 months after the ceasefire. He enrolled in the Culinary Academy and studied under Danny Cook personally for 2 years. Danny said later that Fen had the best instincts of any student he had ever trained, human or otherwise. "That boy listens to the food," Danny said. "Most people cook with their hands. Fen cooks with his whole self." Fen graduated at the top of his class and returned to his home world, a dusty, wind-scoured planet called Valor Sec, and opened the first Valoran-operated barbecue restaurant in the history of his species. He called it the First Bite. The line on opening day wrapped around the building and did not thin for 3 weeks. The galactic community watched all of this with a mixture of disbelief and fascination. Political analysts wrote long papers trying to explain how a conflict that had consumed millions of lives and trillions of credits had been resolved, in part, by pork ribs and peach cobbler. Military historians studied the Helion Accords and argued about whether the cook provision was a stroke of genius or a bizarre footnote. Philosophers debated what it said about the nature of conflict and connection, that the simple act of sharing food could do what a decade of warfare could not. Danny didn't read any of the papers. He didn't watch the news coverage. He was too busy. He had a kitchen to run, students to teach, and a supply of fresh peaches that had just arrived from a Valoran agricultural world that had, against all odds, figured out how to grow them in alien soil. The peaches weren't perfect yet. They were a little too firm, a little too pale, but they were real and they were sweet, and Danny could work with that. 3 years after the signing, a journalist from the Galactic Press Network traveled to Relay 11, which had been converted into a museum, to record interviews for a documentary about the ceasefire. She spoke to Nate Grady, who had retired from the military and was teaching conflict resolution at a university on Earth. She spoke to Peggy Dunn, who was now the Terran ambassador to the Valoran Dominion, and was widely regarded as one of the finest diplomats of her generation. She spoke to Danny Cook, who gave a short, modest interview, and then excused himself because he had a brisket in the smoker, and it wasn't going to check itself. And she spoke to Keth Voron. Keth was older now. His scales had lost some of their sheen, and his movements were slower than they had been during the war. But his eyes were the same, amber and deep, and carrying the weight of everything he had seen and done. He sat in the same room where the accords had been signed, at the same table where he had tasted barbecue for the first time. And he looked at the journalist with the patience of a being who had fought a war and then been brave enough to stop fighting it. She asked him the question that everyone wanted answered. Why had the Valoran agreed to peace? After 11 years, after so much death, after so much hatred, what had changed? Keth was quiet for a long time. The journalist waited. The camera kept recording. "We spent 11 years fighting humans," he said at last. His voice was low and measured, and the translator rendered it with a clarity that felt almost gentle. "We studied their weapons. We studied their tactics. We studied their ships and their strategies and their technology. We believed we understood them. We did not." He looked down at the table. His lower left hand rested on the surface, the same hand that had picked up that first rib all those years ago. "Any species that puts that much care into something as simple as feeding another living creature," he said, "that much thought, that much time, that much of what I can only call love, that is not a species you go to war with." He looked back up at the journalist. "That is a species you sit down and eat with." The journalist asked if there was anything else he wanted to add. A faint expression crossed his face, something that Peggy Dunn, watching the interview later, recognized immediately as the Valoran equivalent of a fond smile. "If you are fortunate," Keth said quietly, "they will make you the cobbler." The camera held on his face for a moment longer, and then the interview was over. Somewhere on Tessara 3, in a kitchen with good ventilation and enough counter space to roll out biscuit dough, Danny Cook pulled a tray of cornbread from the oven and set it on the counter to cool. Through the kitchen window, he could see a group of Valoran students practicing their knife cuts on a row of onions, their 4 hands moving in careful, focused rhythm. One of them looked up and caught Danny's eye through the glass. The student's crest rose slightly, a sign of pride, and he went back to his onions. Danny cut a square of cornbread, spread it with honey butter, and ate it standing up, the way he always did, leaning against the counter, with one ankle crossed over the other, and the warm afternoon light falling through the window. It was quiet. It was simple. It was exactly where he was supposed to be. Outside, on a planet that neither species had heard of 5 years ago, the smell of good food drifted out of the kitchen and into the open air. And anyone who passed by, human or Valoran, couldn't help but slow down just a little and breathe it in and feel for a moment that the universe was a place that made sense. The war had gone on for 11 years. 11 years of burning colonies, shattered fleets, and names etched into memorial walls that stretched longer with every passing month. The Terran Collective and the Valoran Dominion had been killing each other across a stretch of space so vast that most civilians on either side had never even seen the border they were supposedly fighting over. But the dead kept piling up, and eventually both sides ran out of the will to keep counting. The ceasefire talks were proposed by a neutral trade guild that had grown tired of losing cargo ships to stray weapons fire. Neither side wanted to be the first to agree, but neither side could afford another year of war. So they both said yes at the same time and pretended the other had blinked first. The meeting point was an old mining station called Relay 11, a rusted, hollow structure floating in the dead space between Terran and Valoran territory. It had been abandoned for decades. The air recyclers wheezed. The lights flickered. It smelled like metal and dust and forgotten things. It was, in every way, a miserable place to try to build peace. Commander Nate Grady arrived aboard the carrier Starfall with a small delegation of officers, diplomats, and security personnel. Nate was 41 years old, broad across the shoulders, and had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of something patient. He was from a small town in Nebraska, a place with wide skies and not much else, and he carried himself with the quiet steadiness of a man who had learned long ago that raising your voice rarely solved anything. He had lost his older brother, Luke, in the Battle of Cygnus Reach during the 3rd year of the war. He never talked about it. Everyone who served with him could see it, sitting behind his eyes, like a stone at the bottom of a clear river. Nate had been chosen for this assignment because he was calm under pressure, and because he had a reputation for not doing anything stupid. In a situation this delicate, that was worth more than medals. His cultural liaison was a young woman named Peggy Dunn, 28 years old, sharp as a tack, and possessing the rare ability to talk to anyone about anything without making them feel small. She had studied Valeran language and customs for 6 years, and was one of the few humans in the collective who could read their body language with any accuracy. She had freckles, red hair that she kept in a short ponytail, and a smile that could disarm a room faster than any weapon Nate had ever seen. The Valeran delegation arrived 2 hours later aboard a warship that dwarfed the Starfall the way a mountain dwarfs a hill. It was black and angular, covered in ridges and spines that served no aerodynamic purpose, but looked deeply intimidating, which was the entire point. Their leader was Warblade Keth Varan. Keth was 7 feet tall, and built like something designed to survive the end of the world. His skin was covered in dense, interlocking scales that shimmered between black and dark green, depending on the light. He had 4 arms, each one thick with corded muscle, and a face that was vaguely reptilian, but with a heavy brow and deep-set eyes that glowed a faint amber in low light. Along the top of his skull ran a ridge of bony plates, a crest that lay flat against his head like armor. He moved with the controlled precision of a predator who had long ago stopped needing to prove he was dangerous. Keth had fought humans since he was barely old enough to hold a blade. He had killed them in boarding actions, in ground assaults, in the cold vacuum of space. He respected their stubbornness the way one respects a disease that refuses to die, no matter how many times you burn it out. But he did not like them. He found them loud, emotional, irrational, and bafflingly fragile. The fact that such a soft species had held the Dominion to a stalemate for over a decade was to him a source of deep and personal frustration. He had come to this station because his high command had ordered him to come. He intended to negotiate the minimum acceptable terms, sign whatever needed to be signed, and leave. Nothing more. The 2 delegations met in the station's central hub, a large circular room with a long table in the middle, and armed guards lining every wall. The Valerans stood on one side, the humans stood on the other. The air between them was thick enough to choke on. Nate extended his hand. Keth stared at it. Peggy leaned in and quietly explained the gesture through the translator. Keth looked at the hand for a long moment, then reached out with his lower right arm and gripped it. His hand engulfed Nate's completely. The scales were warm and dry and hard as stone. They sat down. The talks began. They were, predictably, awful. Every point was contested. Every word was examined for hidden insult. The translator struggled with idioms. Keth accused the humans of stalling. Nate calmly denied it. Keth's second-in-command, a stern female officer named Drayan Salth, watched everything with the unblinking focus of a hawk circling a field. By the end of the first session, they had agreed on exactly nothing. During the break, Nate found Peggy standing by a viewport, looking out at the stars with her arms crossed and her brow furrowed. "We're losing them," she said without turning around. "They don't trust us. They don't even want to be in the same room with us. If we don't find a way to break through the wall they've put up, these talks are going to collapse before they even start." Nate leaned against the bulkhead and rubbed the back of his neck. "What do you suggest?" Peggy was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in her expression, a small light turning on behind her eyes. She turned to face him. "Back on Earth," she said, "when two groups couldn't find common ground, they used to sit down and share a meal, break bread together. It doesn't solve anything by itself, but it changes the energy in the room. It's hard to hate someone when you're eating with them." Nate raised an eyebrow. "You want to have dinner with the Valoran?" "I want to cook for them," Peggy said. "Or rather, I want someone who actually knows how to cook to do it. The Valoran eat nutrient blocks, compressed, flavorless, efficient. That's all they've ever known. Imagine spending your entire life eating cardboard, and then someone puts a real meal in front of you for the first time." Nate considered this. It was unconventional. It was possibly ridiculous. But they were running out of conventional options. "Who did you have in mind?" he asked. Peggy was already pulling out her communicator. "There's a cook on the Starfall," she said. "Civilian contractor, runs the enlisted mess. The crew would mutiny if you transferred him. His name is Danny Cook, and I promise you, Nate, that man can make a Valoran warlord forget he's ever been to war." Nate looked at her for a long time. "Send the request," he said. Peggy grinned and pressed the button. Somewhere aboard the Starfall, in a cramped galley that smelled like garlic and good decisions, a communicator buzzed on the counter next to a cast-iron skillet. A stocky man with flour on his hands picked it up, read the message, and smiled the kind of smile that meant someone, somewhere, was about to eat very well.